In the summer of 1195, the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim Spain, suffered one of its darkest days. At the Battle of Alarcos, the armies of Castile under King Alfonso VIII marched confidently to face the Almohad Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur. Alfonso believed his knights could break the Muslim line as they had done in smaller skirmishes before. He was wrong. The clash was brutal. The Castilian cavalry charged, only to be surrounded and overwhelmed by the sheer size and discipline of the Almohad host. Thousands of Christian soldiers were cut down, their banners trampled into the dust. Alfonso himself barely escaped with his life. The defeat shattered Castilian prestige. City after city fell to the Almohads as they pushed north, halting only at the gates of Toledo. For Christian Spain, the momentum of the Reconquista had flipped overnight. And if that wasn't bad enough, political infighting tore the Christian kingdoms apart. Alfonso's allies blamed him for the disaster, and rival kings turned on each other instead of uniting against their common enemy. The Muslims now held the advantage, and for a time, it seemed that the dream of a Christian Iberia might die at Alarcos. By the end of the 12th century, a new player had entered the stage. In 1199, Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Nasir ascended the Almohad throne. Unlike many rulers who inherited empires only to squander them, al-Nasir was determined to prove his strength. Almost immediately, he turned his gaze southward, toward North Africa, where rebellious factions threatened to splinter Almohad power. The most dangerous of these were the Banu Ghaniya, a powerful family with deep roots in the Mediterranean. They had carved out their own domains, holding parts of Tunisia and even the island of Majorca. If left unchecked, they could have challenged Almohad dominance. But al-Nasir struck swiftly. His forces crushed the rebellion, reclaimed Tunisia, and reasserted control over the Balearic Islands. By 1205, the Almohads were once again the unchallenged masters of the Western Islamic world, their banners stretching from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the shores of the Mediterranean. But across the sea, in Iberia, the Christian kingdoms had not forgotten Alarcos. King Alfonso VIII of Castile, humiliated and scarred from his crushing defeat, was biding his time. He knew a single kingdom could never stand against the might of the Almohads. So he turned to politics. For a decade, Alfonso worked tirelessly to mend old wounds and build new alliances. He reconciled with Leon, eased tensions with Navarre, and secured a fragile understanding with Aragon. Slowly, the fractured Christian North began to knit itself back together. By 1209, both sides were preparing for something greater. Al-Nasir had consolidated his empire, and Alfonso was forging unity among the Christians. The stage was being set for a collision unlike anything Iberia had ever seen. The next war would not just decide borders, it would decide the future of Spain itself. By the year 1211, it seemed as if the tide of history once again favored Islam in Iberia. That summer, Almohad forces under Caliph al-Nasir crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and stormed northward with overwhelming strength. Their target was the fortress of Salvatierra, a stronghold belonging to the Order of Calatrava, Christian warrior monks sworn to defend the frontier. For weeks, the brothers of Calatrava resisted, their white mantles, with black crosses, standing defiant against a sea of banners bearing the Almohad emblem. But they were outnumbered, surrounded, and cut off. Finally, the fortress fell. The loss was catastrophic, not just militarily, but symbolically. It proved the Christians could not withstand another full-scale Almohad invasion. King Alfonso VIII of Castile realized the time for local alliances was over. Against this enemy, Iberia needed something greater, something transcendent. So, it did what few kings dared. He appealed directly to the Pope in Rome. Pope Innocent III was no ordinary pontiff. He was ambitious, bold, and deeply convinced that Christendom itself was under siege. When he heard of Salvatierra's fall, he recognized the threat immediately. If the Almohad succeeded in crushing the kingdoms of Spain, Christian Europe would face Islamic power, surging into France itself. Innocent framed the coming conflict not as a border war, but as a holy struggle equal in importance to the battles for Jerusalem. In 1212, he issued a call for a crusade, not in the Holy Land, but in Spain. His message spread like wildfire through cathedrals, monasteries, and marketplaces. From Paris to Lisbon, Priests thundered from the pulpits, Deus vult, God wills it. Every Christian knight who took up the cross would receive the same indulgences, the same promise of salvation, as those who fought in the sands of the Levant. The response was staggering. From France came thousands of crusaders, noblemen and peasants alike, spurred on by preachers and the chants for glory. From Portugal, warriors rallied to the cause, eager to strike back at the Almohads, who had pressed their borders for generations. But perhaps most crucial of all were the warrior orders. The Knights Templar, clad in their white mantles with the red cross, the Knights Hospitaller, veterans of Jerusalem, and the native Spanish orders, the Knights of Santiago and Calatrava. Hardened by decades of frontier war, these men brought discipline, fanatical courage, and the unshakable belief that they were fighting in God's name. By the spring of 1212, what had once been a fractured Iberian resistance was now transformed into something new, a united Christian coalition. For the first time in living memory, the kings of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre put aside their rivalries. They gathered their banners under a single cause, to confront al-Nasir's vast army before it could sweep across the peninsula. But the path ahead was uncertain. Many crusaders who had journeyed from France grew weary of the hardships of the Spanish plains. The sun was merciless, the terrain barren, and supplies were scarce. Some turned back even before the decisive battle was joined. Others pressed forward, driven by faith, vengeance, or the promise of eternal reward. Meanwhile, al-Nasir prepared with grim determination. From Morocco and Al-Andalus, he summoned an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, though medieval chroniclers often exaggerated. What mattered was that his host dwarfed the Christian coalition. His camp stretched across valleys, glittering with silks, weapons, and the banners of countless tribes and contingents from across North Africa. At its heart stood the black tent of the caliph himself, a symbol of Almohad might. In July of 1212, the two sides finally converged in the rugged mountains of central Spain, near a narrow pass known as Despinaperos. The Christians sought a way through to reach al-Nasir's army. Local shepherds, familiar with every crag and hidden trail, guided them along secret paths. By maneuvering through these difficult routes, the coalition emerged onto the plains behind the Almohad lines. It was here, on July 16th, that destiny would be decided, at a place forever remembered as Las Navas de Tolosa. The Christians arrayed themselves for battle. Alfonso VIII of Castile at the center, supported by the military orders, King Sancho VII of Navarre on one flank, King Peter II of Aragon on the other. Facing them was the vast, disciplined host of al-Nasir. At its core, the caliph had stationed his elite black guard, slave warriors chained together, sworn to die before allowing any enemy near their master's tent. As dawn broke, the crusaders advanced. Trumpets blared, drums thundered, and a forest of lances lowered as thousands of Christian knights spurred their war horses forward. The Almohads responded in kind. Arrows darkened the sky, and the earth shook beneath the clash of cavalry and infantry. The fighting raged for hours. Lines broke, reformed, and broke again. The orders of Santiago and Calatrava hurled themselves into the thickest combat, their crosses gleaming as they carved through enemy ranks. Finally, as the day wore on, the tide shifted. The Christians broke through the Almohad center and charged directly toward al-Nasir's camp. There, they encountered the caliph's chained blackguard. In one of the most brutal clashes of the battle, the knights hacked, thrust, and struggled against warriors who could neither retreat nor surrender. One by one, the chains were cut, and the line collapsed. Sancho of Navarre, towering above most men, is said to have personally led the charge that breached the caliph's defenses. The Christian banners surged forward, and al-Nasir himself fled the field, his once mighty army in ruin. The victory at Las Navas de Tolosa was not just a battlefield triumph, it was a turning point. For the first time, the Almohads had been decisively crushed in open battle. The Reconquista, long stalled since Alacas, now gathered unstoppable momentum. Within a generation, most of southern Spain would slip from Muslim hands. What had begun with the fall of a small fortress at Salvatierra ended with the shattering of a caliph's army, and the cry of Deus vult echoing across the hills of Iberia. In the summer of 1212, the Crusader banners, once again unfurled across Iberia. Answering the papal call, armies converged on Toledo, turning the ancient city into a sea of tents, steel, and crosses. Alfonso VIII now stood at the head of the largest Christian coalition Spain had ever seen. Knights from Castile, Leon, Navarre, Aragon, and even contingents from France and Portugal gathered for one purpose: to march south and crush the Almohads. The first targets were symbolic. Malagon, a fortress held by Muslim garrisons, fell quickly. Soon after, Calatrava, once the proud headquarters of the Order of Calatrava, before it was lost at Alarcos, was retaken. For Alfonso's men, this was more than a military victory. It was vengeance, a reclamation of honor lost 17 years earlier. But the campaign was not without cracks. The French knights who had marched across the Pyrenees expected glory on the battlefield, not the blistering sun of Castile. As the army pushed deeper into enemy territory, the relentless heat, lack of supplies, and harsh landscape wore them down. Bitter arguments broke out. Many of the French crusaders decided they had endured enough. One night, they simply left, turning north and abandoning the campaign altogether. What remained, however, was still formidable. The Spaniards, hardened by generations of frontier warfare, pressed on. Alfonso, though disappointed, understood that this was now a war for Iberia itself. Whether or not France stood with him, Castile and her allies could not turn back. By July, the Christian host advanced southward, only to find their path blocked. The Almohad Caliph al-Nasir had chosen his ground carefully. He deployed his massive army behind the Sierra Morena Mountains, a natural barrier of rugged passes and steep ridges. If the Christians attempted a direct assault, they would be funneled into narrow paths, where Almohad numbers could overwhelm them. To many, the campaign looked doomed. In Toledo, the crusade had begun with songs of triumph and prayers of glory. Now, deep in enemy territory, morale faltered. Supplies ran thin, and the sheer size of al-Nasir's host loomed like a storm over the horizon. Yet Alfonso refused to retreat. He knew that turning back would mean not just the collapse of the crusade, but the loss of Christian unity itself. As both armies stared at each other across the Sierra Morena, the fate of Iberia hung by a thread. Somewhere in those mountains lay a path, a weakness in the Almohad wall, and if the Christians could find it, history itself might be rewritten. As the Crusader host stood at the edge of the Sierra Morena, despair began to seep into the ranks. The Almohads held the high ground, their vast camp bristling with banners, horsemen, and spears. Every pass through the mountains was blocked, every valley guarded. To attack directly would be suicide. Alfonso VIII called a council of war. Kings Pedro of Aragon and Sancho of Navarre, along with the masters of the military orders, gathered to weigh their options. Voices were tense, faces drawn with fatigue. They all knew the truth. If the crusade stalled here, it would collapse. Thousands of men would desert, and al-Nasir would march north unchecked. But how could they break through? It was then, in the midst of heated debate, that an unlikely figure appeared, a humble shepherd named Martin al-Hajjah. According to later chronicles, Martin had roamed these mountains his whole life. He knew every ridge, every hidden path. Bowing before the kings, he offered them what seemed impossible, a way through the Sierra Morena, one that bypassed the Almohad defenses. At first, the commanders were skeptical. Could a shepherd truly hold the key to the survival of Christendom in Spain? But desperation has a way of forcing bold decisions. Alfonso listened carefully, questioned Martin closely, and at last, he believed him. Under cover of night, the army began to move. The air was heavy, filled with the sound of armor rattling and horses snorting, yet every man knew the importance of silence. Guided by Martin al-Hajjah, they left the main road and entered the narrow goat trails that twisted through the rocky slopes. The path was treacherous, steep ridges, loose stones, sudden drops, but it was undefended. Al-Nasir had assumed no army could pass this way. Hour after hour, the great host wound its way through the dark mountains. Torches were kept low, voices hushed. The knights of Santiago and Calatrava led the way, followed by rank upon rank of Castilian infantry. Behind them came Aragonese horsemen, then Navarrese troops, then the heavy cavalry that Alfonso had saved for the decisive moment. By dawn, the Christians emerged on the far side of the Sierra Morena. Before them stretched the plain of Los Navas de Tolosa, and to their astonishment, they had come not against the front of al-Nasir's army, but against its flank and rear. The Almohad camp was massive, a city of tents and pavilions, guarded by rows of troops and lines of cavalry. But it was vulnerable, caught unprepared for an enemy appearing from this direction. The shepherd's path had worked. For the first time in the campaign, fortune favored the Crusaders. Alfonso's men gazed out across the plain. They saw the green banners of the Almohads fluttering in the wind, heard the drums and trumpets of the caliph's host, and felt the weight of destiny pressing upon them. Here, in this valley, everything would be decided. If they triumphed, the Reconquista would surge forward, changing the map of Iberia forever. If they failed, the dream of driving back the crescent might die with them. The kings looked at one another, then at their men. The shepherd had led them to this moment. Now it was up to steel, blood, and faith. The Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa, July 16th, 1212. The sun rose blazing over the fields of Andalusia, casting long shadows across the rolling plain. At the northern edge, banners of the cross rippled in the wind. Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, three kingdoms that so often quarreled, now stood side by side, united against a common enemy. Across from them, on the higher ground, the vast host of the Almohads stretched as far as the eye could see. Green standards embroidered with Quranic verses waved defiantly above the tents. The Caliph al-Nasir had brought warriors from across North Africa, Berber cavalry, Black African guards, and Andalusian volunteers, all burning with zeal to halt the advance of the Christians. The Christians were outnumbered, perhaps 2 to 1. Yet Alfonso VIII of Castile did not falter. He knew there was no retreat, no second chance. Behind him, his knights sat tense in their saddles, chain mail glinting, lances angled toward the enemy. The infantry gripped their shields, murmuring prayers. Deus vult. God wills it, was the cry that surged through the ranks. The battle began with the roar of trumpets and the pounding of war drums. The Christian vanguard advanced across the plain, arrows and javelins raining down upon them. The Almohads had formed solid defensive lines, rows of spearmen with long shafts angled forward, slingers and archers hurling death from behind. Each charge by the Christians smashed against this living wall like waves against a cliff. King Alfonso himself led the first assault. With his royal banner fluttering above him, he spurred his warhorse straight into the fray, sword flashing. His men cheered and followed, their lances splintering against Almohad shields. Yet the defenders did not break. Again and again, Alfonso rallied his troops, charging at the head of his cavalry, once, twice, 3 times. His armor was battered, his horse bloodied, but he would not yield. Chroniclers later wrote that it was his courage alone that prevented the Christian army from faltering. Beside him, King Pedro of Aragon hurled his knights forward in furious waves, their Catalan war cries echoing across the field. Sancho of Navarre pressed on from the flank, his men hacking and thrusting with relentless determination. The military orders, the Knights of Santiago, Calatrava, and the Temple, formed the hard core of the Christian army, their discipline holding firm even under the storm of missiles. For hours the battle raged without decision. Dust and smoke filled the air. Horses screamed. Men shouted prayers and curses. The clash of steel rang over the plain. But slowly, the Christians began to gain ground. Step by step, charge by charge, they pushed the Almohad front line back toward the caliph's camp. And there, at the heart of the battlefield, loomed the most formidable obstacle of all. Surrounding the tent of Caliph al-Nasir was his elite guard, black warriors from Africa, chained together in a living wall of steel. Each man was bound to the next by heavy iron collars linked with chains, so that they could not retreat even if they wished. Armed with long spears and massive shields, they formed an immovable circle, a fortress of flesh and iron protecting their sovereign. Behind them, the caliph watched anxiously, mounted upon a richly adorned horse beneath a pavilion of silk. The Christian cavalry hurled themselves against this ring again and again, but the wall held. Lances shattered, Swords glanced off shields. Arrows thudded harmlessly into thick armor. The chained guard stood firm, their spears striking down horse and rider alike. It was then that King Sancho of Navarre, seeing the moment of destiny, gathered his best knights for one last desperate charge. Raising his sword high, he shouted to his men, "Follow me! For Navarre, for Christ!" With a thunder of hooves, Sancho's knights crashed into the chain guard. The impact was tremendous. Men and horses toppled, but the Navarrese pressed on, hacking at the chains, cutting through the iron links. Once one section of the wall was broken, the entire formation began to collapse. The guards fought with savage bravery, refusing to yield, but they were overwhelmed by sheer force. The breach was made. Christian knights poured through the gap, slashing their way toward the caliph's pavilion. Panic spread through the Almohad camp. Drums faltered, banners wavered. Soldiers who had stood firm for hours now began to break ranks, fleeing toward the rear. Seeing the tide turn, al-Nasir lost his nerve. Abandoning his pavilion, he mounted a swift horse and fled the field, his bodyguards scattering in his wake. Word of the caliph's flight rippled like fire across the battlefield. The once proud Almohad army dissolved into chaos. What had been an ordered defense became a rout. The Christians pressed the attack mercilessly. Castilian infantry cut down fugitives. Aragonese cavalry hunted retreating horsemen, and Navarrese knights stormed the abandoned camp. Tents were set ablaze, banners torn down, treasure seized. By sunset, the plain of Las Navas was littered with the dead. Tens of thousands of Almohad soldiers lay fallen. The rest fled south in disarray. The victory was complete, beyond anything Alfonso VIII had dared to hope. For decades, the Reconquista had been stalled, checked by the power of the Almohads. Now, with one stroke, that power was broken. Never again would the caliphs of North Africa threaten the heart of Spain. Within a generation, Christian forces would sweep deep into Andalusia, capturing Córdoba, Jaén, and eventually Seville itself. As night fell, the exhausted Christian kings met amid the smoldering ruins of the Almohad camp. They clasped hands, their armor streaked with blood and dust. They knew they had witnessed not just a battle, but a turning point in history. Navas de Tolosa would be remembered as the day the tide shifted, the day when the cross began to eclipse the crescent on the Iberian Peninsula. And all because one army dared to believe, and one shepherd showed them the way. The battlefield of Navas de Tolosa was silent when the dust finally settled. What had begun as the greatest Muslim army ever assembled in Spain ended in catastrophe. Nearly half of Caliph al-Nasir's forces, some 20,000 men, lay dead or scattered across the Sierra Morena. For the Almohads, it was not just a military loss. It was a shattering blow to their prestige, their aura of invincibility broken in a single day. Al-Nasir himself barely escaped the chaos, fleeing south with only a fraction of his guard. Humiliated and broken, he would die the following year, in 1213. His heir was a boy, far too young to wield power in a time when only strength could hold an empire together. The once formidable Almohad dynasty began to unravel. Their control over Al-Andalus weakened dramatically, and Christian Spain smelled opportunity. One by one, the Muslim strongholds that had endured for centuries began to fall. Ubeda, Baeza, and other cities in Andalusia slipped into Castilian hands. The momentum had shifted permanently. The Reconquista, which for generations had seemed uncertain, now looked inevitable. Navas de Tolosa did not end Muslim rule in Spain outright, but it cracked a foundation beyond repair. Yet the cost of victory was steep. The great military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, Santiago, and Calatrava, had bled heavily in the fighting. Many of their bravest knights never returned from that mountain pass, but their sacrifice elevated the prestige of Alfonso VIII and, above all, the papacy. Pope Innocent III could now point to Spain and say, "Here is proof that God still favors the cross over the crescent." For Alfonso, the triumph restored the honor he had lost decades earlier at Alarcos. For the Christian kingdoms of Spain, it was more than just a victory. It was a sign that unity could achieve the impossible. The rival kings of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, who had so often fought each other, discovered that together they could destroy even the mightiest of enemies. Las Navas de Tolosa became legend. Chroniclers compared it to the great battles of antiquity, a clash where faith and steel reshaped history. In Spain, it was remembered as the moment when the dream of a Christian Iberia transformed into an unstoppable reality. From that point onward, the Muslim Emirates of Al-Andalus would fight not for expansion, but for survival. A century later, the Reconquista would push deep into southern Spain. By 1492, Granada, the last Muslim kingdom, would fall, fulfilling the destiny set in motion at Las Navas de Tolosa. The cross would rise where once the crescent had flown. Even today, Spaniards remember the shepherd, Martín al-Hajja, whose simple guidance changed the fate of nations. They remember Sancho of Navarre smashing through the chain-guarded camp of the caliph. And they remember Alfonso VIII, the king who, after tasting bitter defeat at Aragon, returned to lead his people to one of the greatest victories of the Middle Ages. Las Navas de Tolosa was more than a battle. It was the turning point of a continent,